The American patrol found the Australian position at dawn. 6 men, 1 machine gun, 17 empty brass casings on the ground, 43 dead North Vietnamese soldiers arranged in a semicircle extending from the tree line to within 8 meters of the gun pit. The math didn't work. The Americans counted again. They checked the bodies for additional wounds. Single shots, head or upper chest. Every single one. The patrol leader radioed back to Firebase Charlie. His report sounded like he'd lost his mind. They're firing 1 round per target. Confirm, 1 round. No follow-up. No suppression. Just one. The Firebase commander thought the heat had gotten to him. Nobody fights like that. You lay down fire. You suppress. You dominate with volume. That's infantry doctrine, going back to the Somme. The entire American military complex, from boot camp to the Pentagon, was built on one principle: firepower wins wars. The Australians had a different principle: 1 bullet only. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a guideline for ideal conditions. It was a restriction, enforced by officers who would physically remove your rifle if you violated it. Fire more than once at a single target, and your weapon was confiscated. Do it again, and you were pulled from patrol. The policy seemed insane to every American unit that operated alongside the Australians in Phuoc Tuy Province between 1966 and 1971. It violated everything they knew about combat. It defied the logic that had won 2 world wars. But the kill ratios told a different story. American units in Vietnam averaged roughly 1.4 enemy killed per 1,000 rounds fired. The Australians' estimates ranged from 3.7 to 5.2 enemy killed per 1,000 rounds, depending on which year and which battalion you measured. Some patrols hit ratios that made Pentagon analysts think the reports were fabricated. A 6-man patrol in August 1967 expended 11 rounds and returned with confirmed kills on 9 enemy soldiers, plus probable kills on 3 more. Intelligence later estimated they disrupted a company-sized movement, 11 rounds. The Americans thought it was luck. Then it happened again and again. Month after month, year after year, the Australians kept producing these impossible ratios with this impossible restriction. They weren't just conserving ammunition, they were rewriting what infantry combat looked like in jungle warfare. And the restriction, the 1-bullet policy that seemed like tactical suicide, was the foundation of everything else they did differently. You need to understand how radical this was. The M16 rifle issued to American troops had a cyclic rate of 700,950 rounds per minute on full automatic. Standard doctrine encouraged suppressive fire, poor lead down range, keep the enemy's head down, maneuver under that cover. A typical American platoon patrol carried roughly 3,000,000 rounds of 5.56 mm ammunition. They expected to use it. Australian patrols carried less ammunition per man than their American counterparts. And what they carried, they almost never used. The policy had a name within the Australian task force: aimed fire only. But the troops had a blunter term for it: 1 round, 1 raghead. That phrase, ugly, crude, effective, captured the entire philosophy in 4 words. You didn't spray, you didn't suppress. You identified your target. You aimed, you fired once, you moved to the next target. If you needed a second round, you'd fucked up the first. This gets wilder. The restriction wasn't born from ammunition shortages. Australia could supply its troops. The restriction was doctrinal. It was a deliberate choice based on a radically different theory of jungle warfare. The Australians had studied the Malayan Emergency, where British and Commonwealth forces spent 12 years fighting communist insurgents in terrain nearly identical to Vietnam. They'd learned that in jungle warfare, the side that fired first usually lost, because firing gave away your position to an enemy who might be 3 meters away and invisible in the foliage. So the Australians built an entire tactical system around one core principle: don't fire until you can guarantee the kill. That meant you got closer than American units would ever consider acceptable, closer than doctrine said was safe. So close you could smell what the enemy had eaten, see the brand of his cigarettes, count the mosquito bites on his neck, close enough that 1 bullet was all you'd need. The Americans moved through the jungle with firepower as their security blanket. The Australians moved through it like they'd been born there. Let me take you inside that difference. The year is 1968. The month is February. Firebase Coral sits in the Long Khan Hai province, 38 kilometers northeast of Saigon. The Firebase perimeter is roughly circular, 450 meters in diameter, ringed by a combination of earthworks, barbed wire, and claymore mines. Inside, American artillery batteries, Australian infantry companies, supply depots, and a constant argument about how to patrol the surrounding jungle. The Americans wanted to dominate through presence, large patrols, frequent movement, aggressive posture, show the enemy who controlled the ground. The Australian commander, a lieutenant colonel named Murray, a veteran of Korea and Malayan campaigns, had a different view. "You're not controlling anything," he told an American major during a tactical briefing. "You're advertising where you are. The enemy hears you coming from 400 meters out. He either avoids you or sets up an ambush. Either way, you learn nothing." The major asked what Murray proposed instead. "We disappear." The Australian method started with patrol size. American patrols averaged 12 to 20 men. Australian patrols, 6 men, sometimes 5, occasionally 4. The smaller size wasn't a weakness. It was the entire point. 6 men could move silently. 6 men could hide in terrain where 20 men would be visible. 6 men didn't need radio checks every 30 minutes because 6 men who'd trained together for months could communicate with hand signals and peripheral vision. But the real difference was in how they moved. An American patrol covered ground. An Australian patrol penetrated it. The average American unit in Vietnam moved at roughly 8001, 200 meters per hour on patrol. Depending on terrain, the Australians, on a tactical reconnaissance patrol, they might cover 200 meters in an hour, sometimes less. They weren't marching, they were stalking. Every step was deliberate. Every pause could last 5 minutes while the point man, often a tracker from rural Queensland or the Northern Territory, read the jungle, broken spiderweb. Someone passed through here in the last 2 hours, disturbed leaf litter in a pattern inconsistent with animal movement. Humans. Recent. A smell that didn't belong. Nuoc mam fish sauce. Cigarette smoke. The particular scent of canvas webbing that had been soaked and dried and soaked again. The Australians could smell the enemy before they saw them. They could hear enemy movement under the ambient noise of the jungle, the specific sound of a human footstep versus a falling branch, the particular rhythm of breathing versus wind through leaves. They developed this capacity through selection and training that made American boot camp look like summer camp. Every Australian infantry soldier deployed to Vietnam went through jungle warfare training at Canungra, Queensland. The course lasted 6 weeks. It broke men. The failure rate hovered around 30%. Those who passed emerged with capabilities that seemed supernatural to conventional forces. They could navigate by dead reckoning in triple canopy jungle, where GPS was decades away and maps were often wrong by hundreds of meters. They could identify enemy positions by sound alone, the specific acoustic signature of a fighting position versus natural terrain. They could move through dense jungle at night without night vision equipment, using touch and spatial memory and an almost preternatural sense of the terrain around them. But the most important skill they learned was patience. The Australians would stop, just stop, for an hour, for 3 hours, completely motionless in the middle of enemy territory, watching a trail junction or a river crossing or a suspected enemy position. They called it close target reconnaissance. The Americans had a different term for it. Fucking crazy. You don't sit still in enemy territory. You move. You patrol. You dominate. Sitting still makes you a target. Except the Australians, sitting still, weren't targets. They were invisible. And while they sat there completely motionless, they were learning everything about the enemy's patterns, timing, force size, equipment, and intentions. Intelligence gathering that would have required multiple patrols over multiple days. For an American unit, the Australians extracted in one afternoon of absolute stillness. And when they finally decided to engage, when the target was identified, the range was confirmed, the escape route was planned. They fired once. Let me show you what that looked like. May 1969. A 6-man Australian patrol operating in the Hat Dyke area, northwest of Nui Dat. The patrol leader was a sergeant named Davies, former sheep station hand from western New South Wales, 19 years old, second tour in Vietnam. His father had fought at Tobruk. His grandfather had died at Gallipoli. Davies didn't talk about legacy. He just moved through the jungle like he'd grown there. The patrol's mission: locate and confirm suspected enemy supply cache along a known infiltration route. Duration: 4 days. Radio silence except for scheduled check-ins. Once you went into the Hat Dyke, you were on your own. They moved at night for the first insertion, 3,800 meters from the fire support base to the operating area. It took them 11 hours. At one point, they stopped for 45 minutes because the point man detected something wrong. A pattern in the ambient sounds that suggested an enemy listening post within 100 meters. They waited until the pattern normalized. Then they moved 3 meters forward and stopped again. By dawn, they were in position overlooking the suspected cache site. They didn't dig in. Digging made noise and left evidence. They simply melted into the terrain, each man positioned to see a different sector, spaced far enough apart that a single grenade wouldn't take out 2 men, close enough that hand signals worked. Then they waited. Hour 1. Nothing. Hour 3. A bird pattern that suggested recent human movement somewhere to the northeast. Hour 7. Voices. Distant. Vietnamese. 2 men, maybe 3, somewhere beyond visual range. The Australians didn't move, didn't adjust position, just listened and catalogued. Hour 12. Movement. A North Vietnamese soldier emerged from jungle 50 meters from the patrol's position. He was young, maybe 18, carrying an AK-47 and what looked like a message pouch. He walked directly toward what the Australians had identified as a probable cache site, a natural depression in the terrain partially concealed by fallen logs. Davies had a clean shot from 40 meters. He didn't take it. Taking that shot would reveal the patrol's position, compromise their mission, and alert every enemy unit in the area that Australians were operating in the Hat Dyke. So he watched. The soldier reached the cache site, moved aside some foliage, retrieved something from the depression, looked like documents, and departed the way he'd come. The patrol now knew the cache was real, was active, and was being used for something beyond just supply storage. Intelligence value, significant. Davies marked the location on his map and prepared to extract. That's when the enemy patrol arrived. 15 men. North Vietnamese Army regulars, not Viet Cong. They emerged from the jungle in 2 columns, moving with good discipline and tactical spacing. They were heading directly for the cache site. Davies and his 5 men were positioned between the enemy patrol and their objective. The Americans would have called for artillery. They would have radioed for air support, set up a hasty ambush, or extracted immediately before the enemy got too close. The Australians did none of these things. They disappeared, not metaphorically. They literally seemed to vanish into terrain that couldn't possibly conceal 6 men. They became part of the jungle floor, controlled breathing, 0 movement, weapons positioned but not aimed because the reflection from an optic could give away your position. The North Vietnamese patrol passed within 8 meters of Davies's position. He could see the lead soldier's bootlaces, could see a small tear in the man's shirt, could smell the fish sauce on the man's breath. The enemy was looking directly at the terrain where the Australians lay hidden and seeing nothing but jungle. This required a level of camouflage discipline that most military units don't train for, because most military units don't need it. The Australians had learned from British commandos in Malaya that in jungle warfare, visibility is a spectrum. You can be invisible at 100 meters, but visible at 10 meters, unless you understand how to break up your human outline, how to use shadow and light, how to position yourself so that the enemy's eye slides past you without recognition. Davies waited until the entire enemy patrol had passed. Waited until they reached the cache site and began whatever operation they'd come to perform. Waited until the noise of their activity would mask any sound of the Australian withdrawal. Then he gave the hand signal. The patrol extracted in absolute silence, moving perpendicular to the enemy's line of advance. putting 600 meters between them and the cache site before Davies finally keyed his radio and called in the coordinates. The artillery strike came 20 minutes later, 12 rounds of 105 mm high explosive. The cache site and everything around it disappeared. Australian intelligence estimated 9 killed, possible additional casualties. The patrol never fired a single round. 0 ammunition expended. 9 enemy casualties. Perfect intelligence gathered. That was the Australian method. But understanding the method requires understanding the men who executed it. These weren't supermen. They were farm kids and mechanics and apprentice plumbers who'd been systematically transformed into something the enemy couldn't predict and the Americans couldn't replicate. Take the trackers. The Australians recruited men from rural backgrounds, cattle stations in Queensland, sheep farms in New South Wales, fruit orchards in Victoria, men who'd grown up reading animal signs, understanding weather patterns, moving through bush country where navigation meant reading the land rather than following roads. These men became the point element on almost every Australian patrol in Vietnam. A tracker named Mitchell, former jackaroo from a cattle station west of Townsville, could identify enemy movement by the way grass was bent. Not just that it was bent, but the angle and the recovery pattern and what that told him about how long ago someone passed and how fast they were moving. He could track a North Vietnamese soldier through a river crossing by reading the subtle disturbance patterns in the water vegetation downstream from where the enemy had exited the river. The Americans had nothing comparable. American trackers were trained, skilled, professional. Australian trackers were born to it. They'd been reading country since they were 6 years old. Vietnam was just different country with different signs. But tracking was only one element. The Australians also selected for a particular psychological profile. The men who succeeded in Australian reconnaissance patrols were comfortable with isolation, comfortable with uncertainty, comfortable with long periods of controlled tension, punctuated by seconds of extreme violence. They didn't need constant communication or reassurance. They didn't need to dominate the environment to feel secure in it. An American psychological assessment of Australian infantry tactics, written in 1970 and classified until 1995, noted that Australian soldiers displayed abnormally high tolerance for ambiguity and extended field deployment without conventional force projection indicators. Translation: they were fine operating in enemy territory with no backup, no artillery on call, no air support inbound, and no aggressive patrolling to show the flag. This made American commanders deeply uncomfortable. The American way of war was built on overwhelming force and constant presence. You established fire bases. You ran patrols from those fire bases. You dominated the terrain through mobility and firepower. The Australians operated outside that framework entirely. They would disappear into the jungle for 6 days, 8 days, sometimes 2 weeks, on extended long-range reconnaissance patrols. No resupply, no extraction. Just 6 men and what they could carry, operating in areas where the enemy had complete tactical control. And when they finally emerged, they'd bring intelligence that American signals intercepts and aerial reconnaissance had completely missed. The one-bullet policy was part of this larger philosophy. It forced patience, it forced discipline. It forced you to get close enough that 1 bullet mattered more than 100 bullets fired from distance. Private Cooper, former diesel mechanic from suburban Melbourne, first tour learned this lesson the hard way during a contact in June 1968. His patrol had set up an ambush on a trail junction. 3 enemy soldiers appeared, moving cautiously but not tactically. They were probably local Viet Cong rather than NVA regulars. Cooper was in the kill zone, roughly 20 meters from the trail. The patrol leader gave the signal. Cooper fired 3 times, 1 at each target. He hit all 3. All 3 went down. Mission successful, right? Wrong. After the patrol extracted and returned to base, the patrol leader pulled Cooper aside. You fired 3 rounds. Cooper confirmed. 3 targets, 3 rounds. 1 per target. Cooper nodded. But you fired 3 times. 3 trigger pulls. Why? Cooper explained he was engaging 3 different enemies. The patrol leader's response became legendary in the battalion. 1 trigger pull. If you need to engage 3 targets, You position yourself so you can take all three with one shot. Or you let the first two pass and you take the third. Or you don't engage at all, but you don't fire 3 times. 3 muzzle flashes, 3 sounds, 3 chances for someone we didn't see to locate us. You got lucky this time. Next time you won't. Cooper spent the rest of his tour internalizing that lesson. By his 3rd month, he could hold fire on a target he could easily kill because the tactical situation didn't justify the signature of even 1 shot. By his 6th month, he was the patrol's primary marksman, taking shots at ranges where 1 bullet was all you'd get. This level of fire discipline seemed pathological to American advisors who observed Australian operations. A US Marine captain who worked with Australian units in 1970 wrote in his after-action report, "The Australians display what can only be described as an obsessive restriction on ammunition expenditure. I have observed Australian patrols break contact and withdraw rather than engage targets, where American doctrine would call for immediate suppression and maneuver. The Australians view ammunition expenditure as a last resort rather than a primary tactical tool." The captain meant it as criticism. The Australians read it as a compliment, because the 1-bullet restriction created second-order effects that transformed how the Australians fought. When you can't rely on volume of fire, you get better at not being detected. When you can't suppress the enemy with automatic fire, you get better at positioning so you have clean shots at close range. When you can't call for immediate fire support every time you make contact, you get better at reading the situation and deciding whether engagement is necessary. The restriction bred tactical patience, and tactical patience in jungle warfare was the difference between hunter and hunted. Let me show you where this philosophy produced its most devastating results. Long High Hills, the Australian Forbidden Zone. The Long High mountain range sits on the coast northeast of Vung Tau, a series of steep, jungle-covered ridges and valleys that had been Viet Cong sanctuary since the French occupation. By 1966, when the Australians arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province, the Long High was considered untouchable. American and South Vietnamese forces had conducted operations there and gotten slaughtered. The terrain was too steep for armor. Artillery couldn't get accurate fire into the valleys. Air support was useless under the triple canopy, and the enemy knew every trail, every hiding spot, every kill zone. The area commander, American, declared the Long High off-limits to conventional operations. Too dangerous, too costly. The recommendation was to seal it off and interdict supplies, going in and out. The Australians looked at the map and said they'd handle it. The American response was essentially, "You're insane, but go ahead." The first Australian task force began operations in the Long High in June 1966. Their approach bore no resemblance to conventional tactics. They didn't try to dominate the terrain. They infiltrated it. Small patrols, 6 men, occasionally 8 for specific missions, penetrating deep into the mountain valleys and ridge systems. They moved at night. They moved in weather that grounded helicopters and made air support impossible. They went in during monsoon season, when normal units suspended operations, and they applied the 1-bullet doctrine with almost religious fervor. A patrol in July 1966, 5 men from 5 RAR spent 9 days in the Long High without firing a single shot. They observed enemy positions, catalogued bunker systems, mapped supply routes, identified what appeared to be a battalion-level headquarters, and extracted with intelligence that reshaped the entire tactical approach to Phuoc Tuy Province. 9 days in enemy sanctuary, 0 rounds fired, but when they did engage, the results were catastrophic for the enemy. August 23, 1966. A 6-man patrol led by Corporal Anderson, former commercial fisherman from Tasmania, 2nd year in the Army, was conducting reconnaissance on a suspected enemy supply route deep in the Long High Valley system. They'd been in position for 14 hours, watching a trail junction from a hide position, roughly 40 meters uphill from the trail. At approximately 16:20 hours, an enemy column appeared. The Australians counted 47 soldiers, 2 platoons, North Vietnamese Army by their uniforms and equipment. They were moving tactically, but not cautiously. They owned this terrain. No Australian or American unit had successfully operated in this valley for 8 months. Anderson had multiple options. He could call in artillery, except they were technically outside the range fan and the valley walls would make fire missions problematic. He could radio for extraction and avoid contact entirely. He could let the column pass and continue the reconnaissance mission. He chose a fourth option. The Australian patrol was positioned on high ground with clear fields of fire down into the trail. The enemy column was moving in single file with 15-meter spacing between soldiers. Anderson identified the column leader, officer, walking 10th in formation. He identified what appeared to be a radio operator, 12th position. He identified the rear security element, last 6 men walking with more alertness than the rest of the column. Anderson's plan was simple and insane. His patrol would engage the column with aimed fire at maximum effective range, roughly 80 meters for an L1A1 rifle. Each Australian would select targets in sequence. Fire once, shift to next target. Fire once, continue until targets were suppressed or returned effective fire. Then break contact immediately and extract via a pre-planned withdrawal route that would take them over terrain too steep for enemy pursuit. The success of this plan depended entirely on the one-bullet doctrine. If the Australians started spraying automatic fire, they'd give away their exact positions, waste ammunition on misses, and probably get overrun by an enemy force 8 times their size. But if they could maintain fire discipline, aimed shots, single trigger pulls, maximum accuracy, they could devastate the column before the enemy could effectively respond. Anderson gave the signal. 6 rifles fired almost simultaneously. 6 enemy soldiers dropped. The Australians shifted targets. 6 more shots. 5 more enemy soldiers dropped. 1 Australian missed, which would later result in significant embarrassment. Shift targets. Fire. Shift. Fire. The entire engagement lasted 38 seconds. In that time, the Australian patrol fired a total of 23 rounds. 3 or 4 per man, depending on who was counting. The enemy column suffered 19 confirmed dead and an estimated 9 to 12 wounded. The column broke and retreated in chaos down the trail they'd just traveled up. The Australians extracted in the opposite direction, moving uphill over terrain so steep they were essentially rock climbing, with full combat loads. The enemy tried to pursue, but gave up after 200 meters. By nightfall, the Australian patrol was out of the Long High and back at their forward operating base. 23 rounds expended, 19 confirmed enemy casualties, 0 Australian casualties. An enemy force 8 times their size routed and demoralized. The after-action report reached American headquarters 2 days later. The intelligence officer who read it assumed it was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Nobody inflicts those kinds of casualties with that little ammunition against a numerically superior force in their own sanctuary. The mathematics didn't work, except it did work, because the Australians weren't fighting the way the mathematics assumed you fought. The Long High operation became a case study in Australian tactical doctrine. The enemy learned that the mountains weren't safe, that Australian patrols could appear anywhere, anytime, without warning, that the Australians didn't need helicopters, or artillery, or air support. They just needed 6 men who knew how to move and how to shoot, and when to do both. The psychological effect on the enemy was severe. Vietnamese documents captured later in the war included specific warnings about Australian patrols. Do not engage unless you have overwhelming superiority in numbers and position. The Australians do not fight like Americans. They are patient. They will wait for you to make mistakes. A North Vietnamese after-action report from 1968, translated and classified by Australian intelligence. Australian reconnaissance teams are extremely dangerous. They penetrate to depths we previously considered safe. They appear without warning. They fire with accuracy at ranges we cannot match. They vanish before we can respond effectively. Recommend avoiding contact, unless absolutely necessary. The enemy was scared of them, not of Australian firepower. The Australians brought less firepower than any comparable unit. Not of Australian numbers. The Australians usually operated in tiny patrols. The enemy was scared of Australian discipline, of their patience, of their ability to be exactly where you didn't expect them, exactly when you thought you were safe. And the one-bullet restriction was the foundation of all of it. But let's be clear about what this restriction cost, because it wasn't free. The discipline required to fight this way broke some men. The psychological pressure of operating in close proximity to the enemy without the security blanket of suppressive fire, it was immense. Some soldiers couldn't adapt. They needed to shoot, needed to hear their rifle firing, needed to see rounds impacting downrange. The one-bullet policy felt like fighting with one hand tied behind your back. The Australian solution was brutal. If you couldn't adapt, you went home. Not immediately, not dramatically, but you found yourself rotated to rear area duties, to administrative positions, to anywhere except a patrol going into hostile territory. The patrols needed men who were psychologically compatible with this method of warfare. Men who could hold their fire when every instinct screamed to shoot. Private Nash, former university student from Sydney, deployed in 1970, described the moment he knew he couldn't do it. His patrol had encountered an enemy squad at close range, 12 meters. The enemy hadn't detected the Australians yet. The patrol leader signaled to remain hidden. Let them pass. Nash couldn't do it. His hands were shaking. His breathing was too loud. He was convinced the enemy would see them, would open fire, would kill all 6 of them because they weren't shooting first. The patrol leader saw Nash's state and made a decision. He sent Nash back to base with 2 other patrol members, scrubbing the operation. Nash never went on patrol again. Spent the rest of his tour working signals intercept at the task force headquarters. Good soldier. Smart, capable, brave. Just not wired for the specific psychological demands of Australian reconnaissance doctrine. The men who could do it, who thrived in it, they were a different breed. They'd found something in the jungle that civilian life hadn't offered, a purity of purpose, a clarity that came from operating at the absolute edge of human capability in the most hostile environment on Earth. Sergeant Williams, former postal worker from Brisbane, 3rd tour in Vietnam, tried to explain it to a reporter in 1971. You can't understand it unless you've done it. Being that close to the enemy, watching him eat, watching him sleep, watching him walk past you close enough to touch. And you're not shooting because shooting isn't the mission. The mission is to learn, to watch, to understand his patterns well enough that when we finally do engage, it's not combat, it's execution. That phrase, it's not combat, it's execution, captured something essential about the Australian approach. They didn't fight battles. They set up conditions where the enemy died before they knew the Australians were there. The one-bullet restriction enabled this because it forced you to think 3 steps ahead. If you only got 1 shot, that shot had to count, which meant you needed to position yourself perfectly, which meant you needed to read the terrain perfectly, which meant you needed to predict enemy movement perfectly. The restriction created a chain of tactical necessities that, when followed, produced results that looked like magic to outside observers. American Special Forces studied the Australian methods extensively. Multiple exchange programs put US Army Rangers and Navy SEALs alongside Australian SAS and regular infantry units. The Americans tried to replicate the techniques. Most couldn't. The cultural difference was too fundamental. An American Ranger who trained with Australian SAS in 1969 wrote, "The Australians have a completely different relationship with ammunition. For us, ammunition is a tool. You use it to accomplish objectives. For them, ammunition is almost sacred. Using it means you've failed at everything else." Their entire tactical system is designed around avoiding the need to shoot. That assessment was partially correct. The Australians did view ammunition expenditure as failure, or at least as a last resort. But it wasn't sacred in a religious sense. It was sacred in a practical sense. Every round fired was a signature, a sound the enemy could hear, a muzzle flash the enemy could see, a piece of evidence you left behind. In jungle warfare, signatures got you killed. The Americans relied on signatures. They wanted the enemy to know where they were, because that's how you dominated terrain. Australians eliminated signatures. They wanted to be ghosts, present but undetectable, observing but not observed. This philosophical difference extended beyond ammunition. Australian patrols used indigenous weapons when possible, captured AK-47s rather than their issued L1A1 rifles, so enemy listeners couldn't identify them by sound. They ate cold rations exclusively in hostile territory. No cooking fires, no smell of American sea rations heating. They cached their packs before final approach to target areas, so they could move with absolute silence. They became indistinguishable from the environment they operated in. A Viet Cong defector, interrogated in 1970, described encountering what he thought was an Australian patrol. "We found their position after they'd left. 6 depressions in the earth where they'd lain. No trash, no cigarette butts, no food waste. The only evidence they'd been there was that the grass was flattened. It could have been from animals. We weren't sure they were real until we found the bodies they'd left behind. 6 depressions in the earth. That was the signature of an Australian patrol. Not the sound of gunfire, not the smell of cordite, just 6 places where the jungle floor had been disturbed by men who'd learned to exist in hostile territory without leaving evidence of their existence. This level of fieldcraft took months to develop. The training at Canungra was brutal, but it was just the foundation. The real education happened in Vietnam, on patrol, under the instruction of veterans who'd survived multiple tours. These veterans, sergeants and corporals, mostly, they were the institutional memory of Australian jungle warfare doctrine. Men like Sergeant Major Davies, no relation to the earlier Sergeant Davies, who'd fought in Malaya, fought in Borneo, and was on his 2nd tour in Vietnam. Davies had killed enemy soldiers in 4 different countries over 12 years of continuous combat. He'd forgotten more about jungle warfare than most soldiers would ever learn, and he was obsessive about the one-bullet doctrine. Davies would take new soldiers on their first patrol and deliberately put them in positions where they had easy shots at enemy soldiers. Then he'd prevent them from shooting. The psychological purpose was clear: teach them that shooting wasn't the default response. That observation and intelligence gathering were higher priorities than enemy casualties. That the mission was what mattered, not the body count. On one notorious patrol in 1968, Davies and his team had clear shots at an enemy platoon leader. High-value target, perfect conditions, easy kill. Davies wouldn't authorize the shot because it would compromise the patrol's primary mission, which was to track that platoon to wherever they were going. So they watched the enemy leader walk past, followed the platoon for 6 hours, discovered a battalion-sized base camp that intelligence hadn't known existed, called in airstrikes that destroyed the entire camp. One decision, hold fire, resulted in strategic intelligence that reshaped operations for the entire province. That was the power of the one-bullet doctrine. It forced you to think beyond the immediate tactical situation to the larger strategic picture. But Davies and men like him were the exception. Most soldiers had to be systematically trained to think this way. The training was constant, repetitive, and unforgiving. Every patrol was a classroom. Every decision was analyzed. If you fired when you shouldn't have, you got counseling. If you didn't fire when you should have, you got counseling. The doctrine required perfect judgment under conditions where perfect judgment was almost impossible. The men who mastered it became legendary. Lance Corporal Thompson, former sheep shearer from rural New South Wales, first tour, became known throughout the task force for never having fired his weapon in combat, despite 11 months in Vietnam and 37 patrols in hostile territory. He'd been in multiple contacts. He'd been in positions where shooting would have been justified. He'd just never encountered a situation where shooting was necessary. Thompson's patrol leader explained it. Thompson is so good at positioning and reading terrain that he never ends up in situations where he has to shoot his way out. He anticipates, he avoids, he maneuvers. Shooting is what you do when you've run out of better options. Thompson never runs out of better options. That was the ideal the Australians were training toward. Not soldiers who could shoot accurately. That was baseline. Soldiers who were so tactically proficient that shooting became rare. Soldiers who solved problems through positioning, patience, and fieldcraft rather than firepower. The American military couldn't replicate this for a simple reason. It required time the Americans didn't have. Australian soldiers deployed to Vietnam for one-year tours, but many extended or came back for second and third tours. The institutional knowledge accumulated. Veterans trained new soldiers who became veterans who trained the next wave. By 1970, the Australian task force had soldiers with 3 and 4 years of continuous Vietnam experience. They'd forgotten more about jungle warfare than most American soldiers learned in their entire 12-month deployment. The Americans rotated entire units. Battalions came in, served their tour, rotated out. The institutional knowledge walked out with them. The Australians maintained continuity. The sergeants stayed. The knowledge base remained. This created a compound effect. The longer the Australians operated in Phuoc Tuy Province, the better they got. Their tactics refined. Their intelligence networks deepened. Their understanding of enemy patterns and behaviors became almost prophetic. They could predict where the enemy would be based on agricultural cycles, moon phases, and weather patterns. They knew which trails would be used when. They knew which villages were sympathetic and which were hostile. And they taught all of this through the lens of the one-bullet doctrine, because that doctrine wasn't really about ammunition. It was about philosophy, about discipline, about understanding that in jungle warfare, the side that exercised the most control over their positions, their movements, their firing discipline, their emotional responses, that side won. The North Vietnamese were disciplined. They had to be to survive years of warfare against a technologically superior enemy. But the Australians were more disciplined, more patient, more willing to forego immediate gratification for long-term advantage. A captured North Vietnamese document from 1970 included this assessment. The Australian soldiers are the most dangerous enemy we face. They are few in number, but their effect is disproportionate. They do not fight as other Western soldiers fight. They fight as we fight, patient, hidden, willing to wait for the perfect moment. But they are better trained and better equipped. This combination is extremely dangerous. They fight as we fight. That was the highest compliment the enemy could give. The Australians had studied the enemy's methods, absorbed the lessons, and improved upon them. They'd become better at the enemy's own game. The one-bullet restriction was a visible manifestation of this philosophy. It signaled to everyone, friend and enemy alike, that the Australians operated under different rules, that they trusted their training and their tactics more than they trusted volume of fire, that they'd rather not shoot at all than shoot without certainty of effect. This certainty came from getting close, impossibly close, closer than American doctrine said was safe or sane. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but widely believed within Australian units, about a patrol in 1969 that encountered an enemy soldier sleeping in a hammock. The patrol had already identified him as a sentry who'd fallen asleep on watch. They were 3 meters away, close enough to count the buttons on his shirt. The patrol leader made a decision. Don't kill him. Don't wake him. Just pass by. They needed to get deeper into the valley, and a dead sentry would alert everyone that Australians were in the area. So 6 men walked past a sleeping enemy soldier, close enough to hear his snoring, close enough to smell him. One man in the patrol, the newest member, was shaking so hard from adrenaline that the patrol leader had to grip his arm to steady him. They moved past. The sentry never woke. The patrol continued deeper into enemy territory and accomplished their mission. Whether that specific story is true doesn't matter. What matters is that everyone believed it could be true. That level of discipline, that level of tactical daring, that level of absolute confidence in your training, it was what being an Australian patrol meant. The Americans heard these stories and thought the Australians were crazy, reckless, operating outside the bounds of sensible military doctrine. The Australians heard what the Americans thought and didn't care. They had the kill ratios, they had the intelligence, they had the results. And results were the only metric that mattered. By 1971, when the Australian commitment to Vietnam began drawing down, the tactical lessons had been thoroughly documented. The Australian Army published training manuals based on Vietnam experience. The one-bullet doctrine was codified as standard operating procedure for reconnaissance patrols in jungle environments. The techniques that had seemed insane in 1966 were now official policy, but something was lost in the codification. The doctrine could be written down, the techniques could be taught, the procedures could be standardized, but the mindset, the psychological shift required to operate with one-bullet discipline in close proximity to the enemy, that couldn't be transmitted through manuals. It required veterans, men who'd done it, men who could explain not just the what and the how, but the why. Why you held your fire when every instinct screamed to shoot. Why you got closer when every cell in your body wanted to pull back. Why you trusted 6 men in the jungle more than you trusted artillery and air support and the entire technological advantage of Western military power. Those veterans came home. They returned to civilian life. They became farmers and tradesmen and ordinary citizens. The knowledge walked out with them. Modern Australian Special Forces still train to these principles. The SAS Regiment, the Commandos, they study Vietnam-era patrol reports like sacred texts. They run exercises designed to replicate the psychological pressure of close-quarters jungle reconnaissance. They practice the one-bullet discipline, even though modern warfare has evolved beyond the conditions that made it necessary. But it's not the same. It can't be. The men who developed these techniques did so under conditions of existential threat in a war that tested everything they thought they knew about combat. The modern soldiers are skilled, professional, capable, but they're practicing a craft that was forged in circumstances they'll hopefully never experience. The last Australian combat units left Vietnam in 1972. The war ended in 1975. The jungle grew back over the trails and Firebase positions and the 1,000 small clearings where Australians had waited in silence for enemies who never knew they were there. The long high hills are quiet now. The bunker systems have collapsed. The trails are overgrown. The villages that once housed enemy supply networks are now tourist destinations. The war is memory, but the lessons remain. In military academies from Canberra to Fort Benning, instructors still teach the Australian approach to jungle warfare. The one-bullet doctrine is studied as a case study in tactical discipline. The patrol reports from Phuoc Tuy Province are required reading for infantry officers learning about reconnaissance operations. The Americans eventually absorbed some of these lessons. Not during Vietnam, they were too committed to their own doctrine. But later, in Iraq and Afghanistan, American Special Operations units operated in ways that would have been familiar to those Australian patrols in 1968. Small teams, limited fire signature, emphasis on intelligence gathering over body count, patience over aggression. The wheel turned. The lessons that seemed crazy in 1966 became conventional wisdom by 2006. But nobody does it quite like the Australians did, because the Australians weren't trying to prove anything. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were just trying to survive and complete their missions in the most hostile environment they'd ever encountered. And they discovered that the way to survive wasn't through overwhelming firepower or technological superiority or any of the advantages their wealthier allies relied upon. The way to survive was through discipline, one bullet only. That restriction, that seemingly insane limitation that made American troops think the Australians had lost their minds. It was the key to everything. It forced you to think, to plan, to position, to understand the terrain and the enemy and yourself well enough that when you finally pulled the trigger, that one bullet was all you'd need. The men who learned this lesson carried it with them for the rest of their lives, not just as a tactical principle, but as a philosophy. Do it right the first time. Don't waste effort on things that don't matter. Be patient. Wait for the right moment. And when that moment comes, don't hesitate. These men are old now. The youngest Vietnam veterans are in their 70s. They don't talk much about the war. When they do, they don't tell war stories in the conventional sense. They don't talk about firefights or medals or dramatic moments. They talk about the discipline, the patience, the feeling of lying in the jungle for 8 hours watching an enemy position, gathering intelligence that would save lives and win battles, and never firing a single shot. They talk about the one-bullet doctrine not as a restriction, because when you accepted that you only got one shot, you stopped worrying about all the things you couldn't control and focused entirely on the things you could. Your position, your breathing, your aim, your judgment about whether this target, this moment, this tactical situation justified the signature of pulling that trigger. Most of the time it didn't. Most of the time the mission was better served by silence, by observation, by patience. And when it did justify pulling that trigger, when the moment came and the shot was clear and the consequences were acceptable, you took it. One bullet, One target, one outcome. Then you moved. Before the sound faded, before the enemy could react, before anyone could determine exactly where that shot had come from, you became invisible again. A ghost in the jungle, present but undetected, watching but unseen. That was the Australian way. That was the method that made American troops think they were crazy and made enemy soldiers think they were supernatural. One bullet only. It wasn't a limitation. It was a philosophy, a way of thinking about warfare that transcended the specific context of Vietnam and became something larger. A reminder that discipline matters more than firepower, that patience matters more than aggression, that in warfare, as in life, the hardest thing to master is knowing when not to act. The Australians mastered it. In the long high hills and the jungle valleys and the rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy Province, 6 men at a time proved that sometimes the most lethal force isn't the one that fires the most bullets, it's the one that doesn't need to.